topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech, inarticulate speech of the heart.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to It's Your Voice, the show that hosts enriching conversations in diversity. My name is Antonio De Loera-Brust, and I'm standing in for Bahia Jackson today. Our guest today is Anoosh Jorjorian, the programming director of the Davis Phoenix Coalition, who has also been really on the front line here in Yolo County, California, of standing up to the national wave of anti-trans rhetoric, actions, hatred. So thank you so much for joining us today, Anoosh, and for all of your work. I know you're real busy.
Thank you, Antonio. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
So I guess, Anoosh, I think maybe how we should start is just if you can just lay out a little bit about what's happening and kind of why it's happening now in terms of the really sustained attack we're seeing on trans people across the country and also here in Davis and Yolo County.
Sure. So, it's been at least a year now that that trans folks and especially trans children, their rights have been under attack nationwide. And so we've seen this in states like Florida and Texas, who not coincidentally are kind of vying for the GOP presidential nomination in 2024. And so the way to kind of motivate people to get to the polls is to create some kind of shocking, almost enemy in a way. And so a very easy target, in a sense, is trans children, because not many people know trans children. The idea of transgender is very unfamiliar to people. Since marriage equality has become the law of the land, gays and lesbians and bis have sort of moved into the mainstream, and prejudice against them is not very widely accepted at this point. Whereas for trans kids and trans adults, a lot of people have very uncomfortable feelings about the idea of transgender identity. And again, there's not a lot of people that they may know are trans. And because of transphobia, it is often not safe for trans folks to come out. So we're in this space that if you're part of the LGBTQ plus community, feels very familiar. It feels, like the beginning of what was the coming out movement, in order to help people understand that, yes, they did know gay and lesbian and bisexual people, and that, these strange sexual deviants that they were called at the time were actually people that they knew and who wanted to get married and have families and children just like anyone else. So we're at this point where, trans folks have actually gotten a lot more rights in the past 5-10 years. And inevitably, this brings a backlash, right? And so when there's an expansion of rights, there's often a kind of backlash to those rights. And again, with marriage equality, we saw this kind of seesawing back and forth over the country, where some states would legalize it and then other states would outlaw it. And it wasn't until we had federal action that it became, that marriage equality became the law throughout the United States. So we're in that place of tension. And it is a very easy topic to generate fear around. And we know that fear is one of the motivations that really drives people to the polls. So that's what's happening at a national level. And so people think of California as being so liberal, and surely we don't have any problems with that. But California is, in fact, a fairly diverse state, and you have areas that are, generally left-leaning and liberal, surrounded by a lot of red counties, and even in liberal Davis, California, we still have folks who are listening to right-wing radio, listening to right-wing media, and picking up these talking points, and are really being fed by them as well. It's a dialogue that's happening between right-wing media and parents who are local to Davis. And so we have a small group of very motivated people who seem to have a very impressive amount of free time, who are basically attacking trans rights at every single level that they can. So schools, libraries, at the city level, at the county level. They are just unrelentingly constantly questioning gender education, the availability of books on LGBTQ plus topics, even trans flags posted in public buildings or near public buildings. These are all topics that they have decided to latch onto and raise a fuss about.
Yeah, I think one of the things that strikes me about what you just said is, and I think about my own experience, with trans people. So one of the things that was interesting for me growing up in Davis is when I was a kid, I didn't know any trans people, or at least I thought I didn't. And then as my friend group got older, turns out I have many friends who have come out as trans, who grew up here in Davis, went to Davis High. And, I think for me, it was, I'm a straight cis man. I was raised, and still am, very Catholic. And so I was not really familiar with this issue one way or another. And so I think in some ways I benefited actually from having my first real exposure to this issue and to this community be a very kind of personal friend level of one day, my friend says, hey, actually, these are my pronouns now. And you knew me as one thing, but I'm telling you now that this is who I would like to be known as going forward. And I think it was relatively, straightforward actually to just be like, okay, well, you're still my friend. It's the same person through. And actually, to this day, the continuity of interests is actually much deeper than that, right? I have a friend who I love talking about, obscure 19th century military history with in high school, who was a trans woman. And that interest was before they were out and is still true to this day. I send them my Master and Commander memes for fans of that Russell Crowe movie. And I think I really benefited actually from just being able to have that first exposure be a very kind of direct, individual, personal level. And it seems to me that part of what's happening now is actually by really trying to raise the costs of coming out, whether that's social costs or just, really legal costs and just, safety costs. It seems like a really concerted effort actually to prevent that experience from happening. And it's sad, I think, that in some ways it feels like we're actually moving backwards on that, where it seems harder if this, I'm describing my experiences as a high schooler in, 2011, 2012, 2013. It actually didn't feel very political. It just kind of felt like, okay, your friend is going through something and you're going to listen and try to be there for them. And it was no different from, our other friend whose parents were getting divorced or who was just going through a tough time with school or whatever it was, right? We were just kind of friends figuring stuff out. And I think it's actually really sad that that kind of depoliticized experience of it has become, pretty much out of reach already for trans youth today, and their cis friends, who I think are actually a very important part of this story too.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of really important issues there. Boy, where do I start? So what you're saying about this experience of coming out as trans being so fraught and so politicized is really true. And what really brought that home to me recently was that we had a local trans advocate, Ebony Harper, who runs California Transcends and has been named Woman of the Year in Sacramento, who's really done a lot of incredible advocacy work in Sacramento. She had what was a pretty typical coming out, and at her time, where, she came out, her family did not accept her. She was kicked out of the house. She was living on the streets. And it took her, she was really insecure for a long time, had substance abuse issues. So a lot of those kind of things that happen when kids get into an insecure situation, when they no longer have a home. And, obviously listening to her talk about this is moving and frightening. But she, in a way, feels bad for kids coming out today and feels that it's almost worse in some ways for them to come out, because it's not just an issue between them and their families. It's now they're under a national microscope. And in a lot of cases, in a lot of states, these kids' families are being persecuted. I have a friend who's in Iowa, and one of her children is now essentially an outlaw because her trans child will continue to use the bathroom that matches their gender identity. And that is now against the law. I know of families in Texas who are desperate to move out of Texas because they're afraid that they'll lose custody of their children because they're trying to affirm their children in their trans identities. And, that is now against the law. Right. So families risk losing custody of their own children, and they are actually doing what is considered by the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Medical Association, to be doing what is good parenting, which is to support your trans children. And the state has decided, no, that's actually, we're going to, ignore the science on that. And instead, we're making the decision that that is bad parenting and that those children need to be separated from their parents, which you can imagine is incredibly traumatic for everyone involved.
Yeah, of course. It's really, it's remarkable how fast the rhetoric went from parental rights to we're actually going to take your kids away. And I think that is a real escalation of policy in a lot of these red states. I do want to point out, by the way, that, how many years has it been since Sandy Hook? And we have had no action on gun violence in this country. We are still seeing children murdered by guns frequently on a regular basis, whether at school in mass shootings or in the home or using guns for suicide. We've had no action on gun violence, even though it is the top killer of children in the United States today. And yet this issue of trans children, which is a minority of children, like a very small minority of children to begin with. And then, so we're going to focus and move that quickly on legislation to bar those children from getting appropriate health care, from joining the sports teams that match their gender identity, from using the bathroom that matches their gender identity. That we have no problem, solving that issue in a matter of months or weeks. And yet when it comes to gun violence, it takes, over a decade, and we still have no progress. Yeah. No, I think it's very clear that, that point you just made about how if you're thinking about what are the kind of number one risks for children in the United States today, trans people really aren't on that list, and yet there's been this really kind of decisive swing. And I think that one of the things that really tells me is just how kind of strategic and kind of premeditated this swing is, right? And it is, I think, the role of right-wing media. And I mean, people have been quite open about this on the right, that this is, a wedge issue for them, right? They see a political upside in causing some sort of moral panic that they think will mobilize, their base, and maybe strikes people as a strange issue that they're not familiar with, and so it's more palatable maybe to attack trans people than it has now become to attack other members of the LGBT community. I do want to just, I guess, maybe narrow in a little bit. So we've discussed the national context. I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about the context here in Yolo County, and just, I guess, a little bit about what's been happening and what the Davis Phoenix Coalition and other activist groups are doing as far as solidarity. So, for folks who are listening to this, who are, looking to help, what are some of the I guess, actions and support demonstrations and other things that you have been leading in response to this?
Sure. Let's see. So first of all, what's happening locally is that we have, it's primarily two moms who are kind of leading this charge in Davis and Yolo County. They have formed a chapter of a group called Moms for Liberty, which is very much a right-wing group. Their agenda is primarily pro-censorship. So not only are they trying to get LGBTQ plus books out of libraries and schools, but also books on non-white history, for example. They, have joined on the anti-critical race theory bandwagon as well. And, as always, with the caveat that critical race theory is not something taught to elementary school kids. Those are things that are taught to college level students, but that, elementary students of all races deserve to understand their place in our nation and in our nation's history. So anyway, Moms of Liberty, very pro-censorship. They partnered with an organization called Brave Books, which is a very kind of Christian evangelical book publisher that, there was a story time with a book that was very coded as anti-racism and anti-CRT, for example. So of these moms, one of them has a trans child and is very unhappy that her child is trans. And so
that's very sad, actually. That's kind of, I didn't realize that there was kind of, that's just a very, for that family, for that kid,
yes,
that seems like a very just difficult thing to work through.
So I'll say that the child is in the custody of the father, who is supportive. And something that's really wonderful about Davis is that child has a lot of other supports available. I know they're friends. They have a really wonderful friend group. And they're also part of a theater group that has also been incredibly supportive and really helped this child through this difficult time. In terms of the mother, this is something that I see very often with parents who have trans children, is that a lot of parents go through what we generally call a mourning period, which is that the parent goes through a period of feeling like they've somehow lost their child or lost the child that they thought they knew. And in many cases, and hopefully in most cases, the parent gets over this. You were saying that, your friend came out but that friend's personality and interests have stayed consistent despite their change in gender identity at least to the public. So for parents too, this is usually what happens, is that the consistency of all the aspects of their child's personality and, obviously history and everything, that carries the parent through that mourning period. And, and then they emerge on the other side actually having a closer relationship with their child. So what we say in Yolo Rainbow Families when parents are going through this mourning period is that it's okay to feel it, and it's perfectly normal to have those emotions and not to feel ashamed about having this mourning period, but to process it separately from your child. So it's not your child's responsibility. Your feelings are not your child's responsibility. And also, your child is usually going through feelings of elation and celebration. And you really want your child to really enjoy those feelings. Again, this is a population of kids for whom, suicide is a greater risk. And supportive parents bring that risk down to the same as cisgender children. Whereas children in a non-supportive environment, that risk remains high. So we want those kids, the times when they're feeling celebratory and happy, we really want them to embrace it and to not, have a parent's feelings to worry about in that time. So in this case, it's very clear that this particular parent is stuck in that mourning period because she can't embrace who her child is. And it is a very sad situation, and it's sad for everyone involved. It is, even if the parent is not accepting of the child, that severing of the parent-child bond because the parent can't accept their child, it's still incredibly painful for that kid. Right. It's painful for everybody in that family.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, this strikes me as just like, these are, I think, nuanced conversations, difficult conversations. I've had them, in my friend group, among my peers. I can only imagine, that it would be a very complicated time, with both high potential for hurt and high potential for really a lot of stronger and more honest relationships between family members that I think just doesn't benefit. I don't think any family, even the most accepting and tolerant family, certainly doesn't. No one benefits from kind of the politicization of the issue and there being such a kind of a fraught national environment where what used to be, just, hey, do you support your kid? Yes or no, is now, well, are you on the left or right? I guess that's kind of a funny way of leading into, it might be best for this not to have been politicized to begin with, but given where we are and what's happening is happening. What are kind of some of the ways that, I guess, you can speak to some of the actions you've led, but what are just some of the ways that, people in Davis, let's say like me, who are not super directly personally impacted by this issue, but who want to support our trans friends and want to support, just creating a community that's going to be an accepting and safe place for future generations of young people who grew up here to be able to come out and feel accepted and included and safe. What are some of the things we can do to facilitate that?
So the first thing I would say is to really look for the truth, because one of the things that is happening with this right-wing campaign and this kind of right-wing media attack is that there's a lot of misinformation about trans children and what the process is if children opt for a medical transition. So, this is for folks who have cisgender children, this is a process you would never need to know about. And so it's not general knowledge. And a lot of people find it very mysterious and, very obscure because most parents are not going to want to talk about the details of their child's transition with casual parent friends. It's a very personal and private journey for families. As all medical, all kind of medical situations with your children are. That's not something you necessarily want to share with everyone. So there's the main thing that we notice is that, we center on the fact that supporting trans children saves their lives. And this is an argument that really makes a difference for people. Parents, no matter what their, own political beliefs are, they want their children to be alive. They want their children to be happy, not depressed. They want their children to succeed in life. And so when we point out that children who are supported are less likely to commit suicide, their levels of depression go down, that is something that makes headway. So that fact is something that is very much under attack by this right-wing campaign against trans children's rights. So that's the first thing. This Moms for Liberty group, they showed a documentary at the public library, and it was disinformation from start to finish. So they cherry pick certain experts and choose scientifically dubious studies and elevate those much like beyond what the scientific consensus is, and use that to mislead people into, thinking that transition happens a certain way or it poses certain dangers to children, and none of this is true. So that's the first thing, is be extremely skeptical of what these folks are saying about children. It's really important to know that children do not get any medical interventions before puberty. So, when 5-year-olds are transitioning, those 5-year-olds are not getting hormone blockers. They're not getting hormones. They socially transition. They change their clothes. Maybe they use a different name. They use different pronouns. They go about their lives. That's it. And then interventions happen in puberty in order to keep those children on a steady mental health level as they go through puberty. Because something that we know from talking with trans adults is that if you are trans, going through your puberty assigned at birth is an incredibly traumatic experience. And that's something that we want to save trans children from going through. We don't want them to be traumatized. We don't want them to experience years of misery if they don't have to. And so that is when we do medical interventions, as we would for any other kind of, mental health issue where, if a child has depression and that child can take antidepressants and that reduces the child's level of suicidality, we absolutely want to put that in play. So I'm losing track of where we were going with this original thing. Oh, yes, what folks can do. So I would certainly encourage folks to sign up for the Davis Phoenix Coalition newsletter. If you go to our website, which is in the crawl below, there's a place where you can sign up for our newsletter. And we're doing calls to action when some of these issues come up. For example, we've shown up at the Board of Education multiple times. So there'll be a small group of parents. Sometimes they bring activists from outside of Davis and outside of Yolo County to make their numbers seem larger. And every time the community has shown up in much greater numbers and really demonstrated a unified front against these forces of transphobia. And I have to say, last Thursday, we did the same thing. And we also had a number of trans teens who were in the audience. members of our Davis Queer Teen Group. And it's amazing how empowering those kids found attending the school board meeting. Not only, some of them spoke in public comment, which was amazing. They were so articulate and thoughtful and compassionate, just really the kinds of things that makes a parent's heart glow. But also they felt so encouraged by seeing people in the audience who were supporting them, and also hearing very strong statements from a couple of the trustees at the Board of Education who made, unequivocal statements in support of trans kids, saying, this is a public school system and our job is to include, support, and educate every child who attends our schools. And that was, that really meant so much to those kids. They were talking about it amongst themselves afterwards, and just knowing what they go through.
Which member of the school board said that, if you don't mind me asking?
So I'm trying to remember who said specifically that, but it was Elizabeth. Oh dear, what is Elizabeth's last name? This is terrible. I can't remember Elizabeth's last name. So, but it was Elizabeth.
Elizabeth on the school board.
She's one of the newer school board members, so I don't remember her last name. And Leah Dara, the president of the Board of Education currently, also made very strong statements. So we were immensely grateful to them.
I think that's fantastic. I did my first public comments to Davis City Council when I was in high school. At the time I was leading the DHS Latinos Unidos. And so, different set of issues, but still, I think a very kind of, I do remember it being a very kind of intriguing and empowering and just kind of strange but fun experience of just, realizing, oh, there's actually like places you can go with your thoughts and opinions as a teenager, of which it seems that, oh, there's these people who are in theory here to listen to you. And I think that as a teenager, that's just generally an empowering thing.
Yes.
I think, I guess while we're kind of talking about how people are engaging local electeds and stuff, I guess, I guess I would ask, what are some of the main asks of local government, whether that's school board, city council, or board of supervisors? Like, what are some of the kind of main things that Davis Phoenix Coalition and Yolo Rainbow Families and other groups are asking of our local electeds right now?
Well, interestingly, our local electeds are doing a very good job overall. And in fact, we've done less asking than we have simply thanking our electeds for continuing to do the right thing. Unfortunately, because of this kind of pipeline of, people who are kicking up a fuss locally to right-wing media and then the feedback loop, our school board and our school district was put on blast by right-wing media for our supportive policies for trans children. And so, something that I know is happening in California is that these groups are trying to seek out children who perhaps have transitioned socially and at school without their parents knowing, or they're looking for detransitioners. So any kids who, maybe thought they were trans and then changed their identity to non-binary, for example. So they're trying to say, well, your kid was like led down this path to being transgender, and now they're not transgender anymore, or they identify differently. And so, somebody should pay for that. So there is a campaign or search currently to find a school district that these folks can sue in and try to make these policies that do support trans children in our individual school districts to somehow make those illegal. And a lot of this is coming under the banner of like the parents' rights movement, which on the surface sounds reasonable. Like, don't parents want to be informed of things? So, but when you're talking about especially LGBTQ plus kids, having parents always informed of exactly what is happening with their children could actually endanger the children. So if you have parents who are not supportive of their kids being part of the LGBTQ plus community, you know, those parents could kick their children out. They could, you know, forbid their children from seeing their friends and socially isolate them. There's a number of things that can happen to LGBTQ plus kids that we know from experience are things that happen because these are things that have happened to adults. And, you know, when they become adults, then they're able to tell their stories. So, and then parents' rights also extends to things like, you know, not wanting schools to require vaccines, for example, not wanting schools to do sexuality education. So there's a number of things, you know, you can even take it to like, you know, parents who don't want their kids to learn about evolution. You know, once you start drilling into what parents' rights can mean, there's actually a lot of ways that parents' rights can threaten a science-based education. So,
right. Though, of course, you know, it feels like they're almost you don't want to fall into the trap of saying, well, I'm against parents' rights, because then, of course, you know, people are, well, I'm a parent, I think, you know, so I think the rhetoric there is I think a little intentionally slippery, it seems like.
Right.
So I had
to micromanage every
right. And you know, pitting, it's one thing to pit parents against the schools. I think where maybe, you know, it's what you're speaking about is that, well, some of these situations is actually, you know, the kids' rights are, and I think that should be the priority. I do want to just real briefly ask, or maybe, you know, also share a little bit. You know, right now it seems like a lot of the focus politically and in terms of the activism that's happening is focused on the schools and is focused on kind of K through 12 education. I'm wondering if you know, one of the things that I've thought about, I guess, just because my peer group, which includes many trans people who grew up in Davis, you know, when you talk to them, the issues are actually obviously no longer at school, but are actually much more related to things like housing and employment. And, you know, very few of my trans friends who grew up in Davis live in Davis. And that's actually more than anything the result of economic issues, right? It's not that they didn't have supportive friends and family here. And some of them, to be clear, very much wanted to get out of Davis because they thought there were better places for them in terms of just general lifestyle and affirming who they wanted to be in. Certainly, it is not a unique trans experience. Many kids grow up in Davis and think, I got to get out of here. So that's, you know, not saying there's anything wrong with that, but it does seem that a lot of trans folks have real issues that are economic issues, about economic security and sustained employment. I know many of my trans peers have had issues obtaining steady employment, paying the rent. There have been times that when folks do come back to Davis, it's because they've kind of had to fall back on that support of their parents or their original community, but it's hard for them to have the independence they would want to have in living here. And this, again, these are broader issues related to housing affordability and issues that are not unique to the trans community. But I'm wondering if you can touch just a little bit about that and kind of what happens after that high school graduation for trans folks in our community.
Absolutely. Well, first, I do want to point out that there's still a lot of transphobia in Davis. And so I know trans folks who've quit their jobs in Davis because they were front facing, and the transphobia at the register or wherever, or, you know, just at the counter was so unrelenting that they simply couldn't take it anymore. And one of the things that Davis Phoenix Coalition does is that we do safe zone trainings for businesses and institutions, government offices, places that are public serving, in order to make sure those places are safer, both for trans employees and for trans patrons. So when we're talking about what you can do, one of the things is just be nice to any trans folks that you happen to see in town. A lot of those trans folks are unfortunately facing a barrage of micro and macroaggressions every day. As to the rest of the issues, anytime you deal with a marginalized population, you're going to run into these issues of employment and housing. Certainly you and I are familiar with the long history of redlining and the ways that discrimination is weaponized to keep people out of housing, for example. Trans folks do find it harder to find employment, to retain that employment, to find employment that gives them health insurance. So all of these things make trans folks economically more insecure than someone who is cisgender and white and a citizen, et cetera. All the things that are privileges, trans folks have a harder time accessing that, and it puts them in a more precarious position. So, while we in the Davis Phoenix Coalition are certainly working on these kind of flashpoint issues of just fighting for equality and to ensure that all marginalized kids in Davis are receiving the education that they need and are secure in their housing and food security and all of that. We do have a longer term goal to ensure that all of our marginalized communities can live in Davis, especially, we have so many folks who work in Davis but are unable to live here because housing is so unaffordable. And, and that ties into our environmental concerns because we have folks who, instead of biking to work, they have to drive in from Sacramento or West Sacramento or Woodland. And so, that brings up the carbon footprint. It increases our traffic issues. There's these issues that concern Davisites, and but they're perhaps not seeing the connection between issues like affordable housing and these larger environmental quality of life issues that people also worry about. So, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I've made this point before in terms of the immigrant rights movement, right? I say, Davis is officially a sanctuary city. And I always say, well, it can't be a sanctuary for immigrants if immigrants can't afford to live here. Right. So I think there's kind of a similar thing there with the trans community, right? Where, you put all this work into developing, a socially tolerant community, but if it's not economically viable for marginalized people to actually live here, then a lot of that is just talk. And I think that this does bring me, I think, to an observation that I've had, which is, look, I'm not trans. I'm not going to pretend I fully understand every part of it. I think, again, my gut reaction is, well, you guys are my friends, or, people are my friends. So I'm going to try to be a good friend and to be nice and to be supportive because I value that relationship. And I think that's just the decent way to be. At the same time, I think this also makes me think a little bit about kind of the material function of prejudice of, some of the things that trans, young adults kind of my age need to make it in Davis are the same thing that working class immigrant families need to make it in Davis. People who probably have very different cultural ideas and assumptions, or, white working class kids too, right? Everyone wants, many of the same things: healthcare, housing, dependable food, good jobs, right? I mean, we talked about how a lot of trans people end up in very precarious kind of low income working class roles, people working as baristas, people working as in supermarkets, right? And how do those jobs get protected, right? We could talk we're running out of time, but we could talk about the unionization drive happening at a lot of coffee shops, and how that intersects with trans solidarity when so many trans workers are in those jobs. And I really think the material function of this prejudice is actually to divide these populations, to get people worked up and angry at, you maybe get one barista to look at the trans barista and say, oh, I don't want to work with this person. When actually what you should be talking about is, well, how can we raise our wages together by organizing together? So I know we're almost at time here. Anoosh, thank you so much. Any closing thoughts for the audience?
Just building on what you said, I just want to, draw some parallels between our different projects. For example, we have a project called Un Cafecito, which is a leadership project for Spanish-speaking immigrant women. And this is something where, we are drawing those connections between different populations of people who are, marginalized in different ways and yet are sharing issues. And, as the Davis Phoenix Coalition, a lot of what we do is very visibly LGBTQ plus focused, but there's a lot of work that we do that can't necessarily be public because we're working with a population who can't necessarily be out about their status, for example. And, in all of these cases, trying to bring these marginalized voices into the center, giving them access to our leaders, getting people to hear who their neighbors are in Davis and why the welfare of these neighbors matters to the whole city. These are things that cross all of our projects, and it's work I'm really proud of.
Yeah, no, I think that's what solidarity is all about, right? And I think the term intersectionality gets used a lot. I've come to actually prefer the term solidarity because I think it perhaps, while intersectionality is very important for understanding how all of our identities, relate to each other, I think solidarity as a principle is actually the idea of, and you should fight for people who don't share those identities with you, because, I am Mexican American. I care a lot about labor rights. I care a lot about immigrants' rights. But that care includes, you build off of the care that the LGBT community has. And I think, you're actually a great example of how the LGBT community has shown a lot of care and concern for other marginalized communities. And that's another way of understanding what's happening, right? Is maybe I don't have that much personally at stake with anti-trans hatred, but I have a lot at stake for hatred generally. And I don't want these right-wing authoritarian movements to succeed because that threatens all the other work on, workers' rights and immigrants' rights and fighting poverty. So it's all bound up together. And I think that, the Davis Phoenix Coalition does a great job articulating and living by that.
And I would say our younger generations really get that. And that's something that absolutely gives me hope, is that they grasp that so much more easily than older generations have.
Okay. Well, Anoosh, thank you so much. I know we're just about at time, so thank you for making the time, for joining us. For our audience, be sure to tune in next Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Time or 5 p.m. Pacific Time on W4CY.com or Talk4 TV. May we all have enriching conversations and diversity this week and every week. So thank you all so much for listening and for joining us today. The work continues, solidarity forever. And this is Antonio De Loera-Brust signing off.
Inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate speech of the heart. Inarticulate